He said she was nobody. That was the exact word he used. And in that single sentence, spoken by an SS colonel standing in a cold courtyard on the German-French border, was hidden the biggest mistake of his entire life. March 11th, 1945, the town of Saarburg. In the courtyard of a former school building, converted into a processing and interrogation center, stands a man who for 2.5 years had decided which detained civilians would be sent further into the system and which ones would simply stay as a name in a file. His name is Friedrich Erich Mannheim, 51 years old, commander of a security and pacification unit. He watches a woman push a water cart through the gate, dressed as a Red Cross auxiliary nurse, and when a subordinate asks if she should be checked, he answers in one flat sentence: she is nobody. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why that exact sentence, spoken with the full confidence of a man used to deciding the fate of others, became the most expensive thing he ever said. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how one woman with a water cart brought down a system that seemed untouchable. Because what happens next only gets more intense. Her name is Hélène Marie Voss. She is 31 years old, from the city of Metz. She has the right papers, the right uniform, the right face for someone who belongs exactly where she's standing. Not young enough to draw attention, not old enough to look out of place. Just a woman with a water cart, doing what women with water carts are expected to do. But behind that ordinary face is a story that neither Mannheim, nor his officers, nor the guards at the gate know anything about. Since November of 1942, which happens to be almost the exact same month that Mannheim's unit arrived in this region and began doing what security units in occupied territory usually do, Hélène Voss had been working as a courier for the resistance network across Alsace and Lorraine. For 28 months, she had been a ghost living inside the occupation. She moved documents, hid downed Allied airmen in a basement beneath a butcher shop on the Rue des Jardins in Metz, and carried intelligence between resistance cells with a precision and economy of movement that a liaison officer, reviewing her file after the war, later described as looking like someone who had been formally trained for exactly this kind of work. Nobody had trained her. She learned it the way people usually learn things when the only alternative is death, and you start paying very close attention to every small detail around you. She had not walked into that courtyard just to hand out water. And here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because what she came to do that afternoon was not, in the strict sense, an assassination. Resistance networks in Alsace and Lorraine in 1945 rarely had the resources or the authorization to carry out targeted killings against specific individuals. What she had come to do was something more specific and, honestly, more dangerous, because it required her to stand in that exact courtyard, in that exact uniform, for a very precise amount of time, doing something that looked like absolutely nothing, all while carrying something the Germans would never have classified as medical supplies. To understand why this story matters beyond being just another wartime anecdote, we need to step back and understand exactly who the man standing in the middle of that courtyard was and what kind of system he represented. Friedrich Mannheim was not a senior strategist inside the SS hierarchy. He was not drafting battle plans or making decisions at the level of army command. What he actually was, specifically, was the officer responsible for a single processing point in Saarburg, a school building converted into a temporary detention and interrogation center for civilians, swept up during raid operations his unit had been conducting through the border villages since the summer of 1944. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, as the American advance pushed through the Moselle and into the Saarland, those raid operations had only intensified. The front was collapsing, the Wehrmacht was pulling back, and Mannheim, a man who understood perfectly well that the chaos of a collapsing front creates very specific opportunities, was using those opportunities with the methodical energy of someone extremely good at doing something he absolutely should not be doing.
And here, I want you to remember one thing above everything else. What you're watching is not simply a war drama about an explosion and a manhunt. This is a story about how a system of power, built entirely on contempt for people it considers insignificant, becomes most vulnerable exactly where it least expects it. The woman labeled as nobody was standing in that courtyard for a reason, and what happens in the next few minutes of her life will completely rewrite the fate of a man who was absolutely certain he got to decide who mattered and who didn't. To really understand what happened in that courtyard, you have to understand the machine Friedrich Mannheim was running, because he was not some background administrator pushing paper in a quiet office far from the war. He was the man in direct charge of a very specific, very brutal process. And the scale of that process is what makes Hélène's 11 minutes so much heavier than they first appear.
Between December of 1944 and March of 1945, Mannheim's unit processed more than 60 civilians through the Saarburg school building. That's not a soldier count. That's not a resistance cell. That's 60 ordinary people pulled out of villages, farms, and small towns, brought into that same courtyard where Hélène later walked in with her water cart. Of those 60, 41 names had already been forwarded to the SD for what the paperwork blandly called follow-up action, a phrase that in practice meant deeper interrogation and often much worse. Of those 41, at least 18 had already been deported by March 11th. The files on the remaining 23 people were still sitting in a cabinet in Mannheim's office, waiting for their turn. This is the part most people miss when they hear a story like this and assume it's simply about revenge or heroism. It wasn't revenge. It was extraction. And understanding that word is the whole key to understanding why this operation existed at all. As the front collapsed in late 1944 and into 1945, German security units across occupied territory faced a very specific and cold-blooded calculation. They knew Allied forces were closing in. They knew their own records, prisoners, and networks of informants were about to become liabilities the moment those documents fell into enemy hands. So before retreating, many of these units accelerated their interrogations, trying to squeeze out every last piece of intelligence from people who had helped hide airmen, move documents, or feed information to the resistance before those same people could be liberated and start talking freely. Mannheim was exceptionally good at this specific, ugly skill. He understood that a dissolving front wasn't chaos to be feared, it was opportunity to be used. Every day the front held even slightly longer gave him more time to squeeze more names, more locations, more networks out of the people sitting in that school building. And that leads to the real reason the resistance decided to act on March 11th. This wasn't about killing Mannheim. This wasn't even primarily about destroying his reputation or making a political statement. It was about 11 specific folders sitting inside a filing cabinet in the east wing of that building. 11 names that had already been referred to the SD. 11 people whose lives were now measured in days, maybe hours, depending on how fast Mannheim's unit worked before the Americans arrived. 11 folders. 11 human beings. That's the actual scale of what Hélène Voss was risking her life for that afternoon. And it's worth sitting with that number for a second, because it strips away every romantic war movie version of this story and replaces it with something much more real. This wasn't about grand strategy or symbolic victories. It was about physically getting 11 pieces of paper out of a cabinet before a bureaucratic machine finished doing what it was built to do to the people those papers represented.
This is also where the deeper, almost philosophical layer of this story starts to surface, the one that makes it worth telling 70 years later. Mannheim's entire operation depended on a very specific kind of power, the power to categorize human beings as either significant or insignificant, dangerous or harmless, worth watching or worth ignoring. His unit didn't just physically detain people. It built an entire administrative structure around deciding whose life mattered enough to investigate further and whose didn't. 60 people reduced to a spreadsheet of names, 41 flagged, 18 removed, 23 still pending, like inventory waiting to be processed. And that exact system, built entirely on the logic of judging who is significant and who is not, is precisely what allowed Hélène Voss to walk straight through the gate that day.
He understood
because in Mannheim's mental spreadsheet, a Red Cross nurse with a water cart wasn't even a line item. She wasn't dangerous. She wasn't significant. She wasn't worth the 10 extra seconds it would have taken to actually check her cart. And that single blind spot, built directly out of his own worldview, is exactly what a small resistance network 6 weeks earlier had already identified and started planning around. That plan had a name. The resistance called it Operation Charbon, meaning coal, and it wasn't improvised. It wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It was engineered, tested, and timed with a level of precision that would impress any military planner. Built by a small group of ordinary civilians who had spent years learning how to survive inside a system that had already decided most of them didn't matter enough to watch closely. And that, right there, is the real educational core of this story. Oppressive systems are efficient at controlling the people they consider threats, but they are almost always blind to the people they've already dismissed as nothing. That blind spot doesn't stay empty forever. Eventually, someone learns to walk straight through it. Now, let's actually walk through how Operation Charbon worked, because the mechanics of this plan are, frankly, one of the most impressive pieces of small-scale resistance engineering you'll ever hear about. And understanding it changes how you see everything that happens next. The operation had 3 moving parts, and each one depended completely on the others working with almost mechanical precision. The first part was Hélène herself, with the water cart. Her job wasn't to fight or to fire a weapon. Her job was to get inside that courtyard, find a reason to stand near the east wing for a specific window of time, and be visible enough to Mannheim and his staff that her presence registered as completely normal. Not suspicious, not memorable, just normal, boring background noise. That single requirement, being forgettable on command, was, in its own way, the hardest and most dangerous job in the entire operation. The second part was a man named André Félix Bouchard, 43 years old, from Thionville, who had spent the previous 3 weeks working as a handyman for the German garrison. Over those 3 weeks, he had quietly gained enough access to the maintenance areas of the school building to know exactly which door in the east wing was consistently left unlatched, because its lock had been broken since January, and nobody had ever bothered fixing it. That single detail, one broken latch, ignored for 2 months by an occupying force that considered itself thorough and disciplined, is the kind of small human failure that resistance networks all over occupied Europe learned to watch for and exploit. The third part of the plan wasn't even physically present that day. Lieutenant Colonel René Edouard Chassaint, 57 years old, a former French Army signals officer, had spent 6 full weeks designing this operation from the outside. He built the timeline, coordinated the roles, and gave Hélène and André instructions specific enough that the entire operation had a formal name before it even began. Charbon, meaning coal. Here's the plan, broken down simply. Hélène's job was to enter the courtyard, establish a visible reason to be near the east wing, and hold that position long enough to look completely ordinary. André's job was to be inside the East Wing's maintenance corridor at exactly 3:45 in the afternoon, because the daily shift change created a 12-minute gap where that corridor would be almost entirely unmanned. His specific task inside that 12-minute window was the filing cabinet. He carried a list of 11 names, the 11 most urgent cases out of the 41 already referred to the SD, and his job was to pull those 11 folders and get them out of the building using a toolbox he had already hidden near the unlatched door 2 days earlier. And then there was Hélène's second task, the one Mannheim had decided didn't even deserve 10 seconds of attention because she was nobody. The water cart itself. Let's slow down here, because the cart is genuinely the entire story.
It was a standard Red Cross auxiliary supply cart, the kind used at civilian relief stations and field aid posts across the entire occupied zone.
2 handles, 4 wheels, a large enclosed compartment meant to hold water containers, bandages, and basic medical supplies. Hélène had been using a cart exactly like this as cover for months. It was familiar enough to be invisible and large enough to carry things that had nothing to do with medicine. On the afternoon of March 11th, that cart held 2 actual water containers, a supply of standard field dressings, and hidden beneath a false bottom that a resistance carpenter named Michel Aubert had built into the compartment 4 months earlier, a German stick grenade and a timing mechanism, also built by Michel Aubert. Before the war, Michel Aubert had been a clockmaker, and the resistance had simply found a new use for a very old skill. That detail matters more than it seems. This wasn't magic, it wasn't luck. It was ordinary people repurposing ordinary peacetime skills into tools of quiet resistance, one modified water cart at a time. Picture the scene fully. 60-plus people in various stages of processing scattered across that courtyard, guarded by armed SS personnel. Mannheim moving through it all with the same calm authority he'd carried for 2.5 years. And a 31-year-old woman from Metz, walking her water cart past the guard at the gate, protected by nothing but the right papers, the right uniform, and one man's absolute confidence that she was nobody. She crossed the courtyard. She stopped at the water station near the East Wing door. For 11 minutes, she distributed water to detainees, exactly what a Red Cross nurse was supposed to do, and exactly what gave André the window he needed. At some point during those 11 minutes, the exact second was never documented and never fully established, even during the later investigation. She reached into the cart's compartment under the cover of adjusting the water containers, and she set the timer. Then she pushed the cart against the base of the wall separating the main courtyard from the east corridor, right beside the room Mannheim's staff used as secondary document storage. Then she walked out through the same gate she'd entered, with the same unhurried pace, pushing an empty cart in front of her. The guard didn't look twice. Why would he? She was nobody. At 4:07 that afternoon, the cart detonated. The blast was mostly contained inside the wall cavity between the courtyard and the corridor. The secondary storage room took heavy damage. 2 filing cabinets were destroyed. Part of the East Wing wall partially collapsed. 3 German administrative staff were injured, 1 seriously. Mannheim, who was inside the main building at the time, wasn't hurt at all. But the explosion had already done exactly what it was designed to do. It destroyed a significant portion of the secondary document records for the entire Saarburg operation. And more importantly, it created immediate chaos, the kind that pulls personnel away from their posts to deal with an emergency, which is exactly what gave André Bouchard the extra minutes he needed to finish clearing that filing cabinet and walk out through the unlatched door with 11 folders inside his toolbox before anyone had reorganized enough to start asking real questions. By nightfall, André was already back in Thionville. Now here's where the story takes the turn most people don't expect.
Because Mannheim didn't die in that explosion. He survived. And what he did with that survival tells you everything about how ordinary evil actually disappears after a war ends. He survived the blast on March 11th.
He survived the American push through Saarburg as the front collapsed weeks later. He survived Germany's full surrender in May of 1945. And in the immediate chaos of the post-war period, he wasn't anywhere near the top of any Allied war crimes list, not under his real name. The Saarburg processing facility hadn't been fully documented yet, and with Nuremberg preparing to try the most senior architects of the entire system, a regional security officer who ran one small-town detention center simply wasn't a priority for anyone with limited resources and an overwhelming caseload. So he did what a striking number of mid-level SS officers did in that exact period. He didn't flee to South America. He didn't build a fake identity or vanish into some dramatic underground network. He simply stayed in Germany, kept his real name, and quietly rebuilt an ordinary life. He found work as a bookkeeper at a small firm in the city of Saarbrücken. He had made a very specific, very cold calculation, that the details of his crimes were narrow enough, tied to one small border town with records partially destroyed by the very explosion Hélène had triggered, that he could simply outlast the administrative machinery before anyone connected the dots. What he never accounted for was Hélène Voss. Fast forward to 1947. Hélène, who had survived the war and returned to Metz, was working as an actual nurse at a civilian hospital, living a quiet, ordinary life. And then, without anyone asking her to, without a subpoena, without pressure from any commission, she walked into the French War Crimes Documentation Office in Metz on an ordinary Tuesday morning and asked to speak with whoever handled cases involving SS security unit crimes in the region. She was introduced to a lieutenant named Christophe Moreau. She sat down across from him, and for 4 straight hours, in the same calm, unhurried voice she had used to push a water cart through an enemy courtyard, she laid out everything she knew: names, dates, specific incidents. The 11 folder names Andre had carried out in his toolbox, the 41 referrals to the SD, the 18 deportations. And then, almost as an afterthought, she told Lieutenant Moreau exactly where Friedrich Mannheim was currently living. Sit with that for a second, because this is the part that should genuinely give you chills. She had found him herself. Not through some official tracking system, not through Allied intelligence, but through the same specific skill that had kept her alive for 28 months inside the occupation.
Here's the plan.
Paying extremely close attention to small, seemingly meaningless details. She had heard his name mentioned in connection with a business transaction near Saarbrücken through a quiet network of civilian contacts she had maintained since liberation. Over several months in 1946, she confirmed his identity through 2 independent sources, and in March of 1947, she sat down across from a French officer and simply handed him an address. Mannheim was arrested on April 3, 1947, at his workplace in Saarbrücken by a joint French-American team. The American side was led by Captain James Albright, 29 years old, from Portland, Oregon, a man who had been doing this kind of investigative work since September of 1944. He later wrote in his official report that the Mannheim case was, in his personal experience, the most precisely prepared case a civilian witness had ever handed him. He used one specific word to describe her testimony. He wrote that she had documented everything. But it's what happened in that room during the actual arrest that stays with you. When Captain Albright and his French counterpart, Captain Duval, entered the office and identified Mannheim, he looked at the arrest paperwork for a long moment. Then he looked up and asked, quite calmly, who had provided the information against him.
Albright, through an interpreter, said only that the source was a civilian witness. Mannheim asked one more question. He asked if the witness had been a woman. Albright didn't answer that directly. He simply said Mannheim was under arrest and could discuss the source with his lawyers. Then, turning to Captain Duval, not realizing Mannheim understood functional English from his years in occupied territory, Albright said quietly, "I think he already knows." And Mannheim, who understood every word, went completely still. Not a flinch, not a single word in response. That silence says more about guilt and recognition than any confession ever could.
Here's a detail that never made it into the official report, but stayed buried in Albright's personal notes. The night before the arrest, April 2nd, he sat at his desk in Strasbourg and read all 68 transcribed pages of Hélène's testimony in one sitting. Across all those pages, he made exactly 3 handwritten notes in the margin, which was unusual for him. The third note, written at the bottom of page 61, right next to her description of walking into that courtyard in Saarburg 2 years earlier, was just 4 words. He wrote, "She was nobody, though." Mannheim stood trial in front of a French military tribunal in Paris in the spring of 1949. And this is where the story finally closes its loop. Because everything that happened in that courtroom traced directly back to 11 minutes in a courtyard 4 years earlier. The charges covered the full scope of what had happened at Saarburg. The more than 60 civilian detentions, the 41 referrals to the SD, and the 18 confirmed deportations. The primary evidence against him wasn't circumstantial. It was Hélène's 68-page testimony, word for word. It was the 11 folders André Bouchard had physically pulled out of that filing cabinet in March of 1945. Folders that had survived the war in a French archive box. And it was the direct testimony of 7 surviving deportees who stood up in that courtroom and identified Mannheim by name as the officer who had personally authorized their transfer out of Saarburg. His defense argued that he had simply operated within the legal framework of a lawful occupying authority, following procedure, doing his assigned job. The tribunal didn't buy it. He was found guilty on every single count. He was sentenced to 20 years. He served 14 of them, was released in 1963, and quietly returned to Saarbrücken, the same city where he'd once hidden as an ordinary bookkeeper. He died in 1971. His local obituary described him, without a single hint of irony, as a retired businessman. Now let's talk about Hélène Voss, because she is the actual reason this story deserves to be remembered at all. After her testimony in 1947 and the trial that followed in 1949, she went straight back to her ordinary life. She kept working as a nurse at that same civilian hospital in Metz, and she stayed there until 1978. Along the way, the French government recognized her wartime service twice, once in 1946 and again in 1972. It's that second recognition, in 1972, that gives this story its real ending. A journalist from a regional newspaper sat down with her and asked about the operation at Saarburg, about the water cart, about the hidden timing mechanism, about the colonel who had once looked straight at her and decided she was nobody. And her answer, published exactly as she said it, has stayed in the historical record ever since. She said Mannheim had actually been right about one thing. Being nobody was exactly what she needed to be. She said it the way she said almost everything, quietly, without drama, with the specific calm of a person who had long ago made peace with the weight she carried, and who had absolutely no interest in performing that weight for anyone else's benefit. That single sentence, spoken decades later in an ordinary newspaper interview, is worth more than almost every medal ever handed to a war hero, because it takes the exact insult that was meant to erase her
and turns it into the very definition of how she won.
Here's what I want you to actually sit with before this video ends.
Picture the scene.
The water cart was in that courtyard for 11 minutes. That's the entire window this whole story depended on. 11 minutes of a 31-year-old woman from Metz being deliberately, calculatedly nobody, while an SS colonel who had already sent 41 people toward deportation walked around barely 20 meters away, completely unaware. 11 minutes of handing out water, positioning a cart, and one quiet hand reaching under water containers to set a timer built by a clockmaker who had simply found a new use for his old skill. Then she pushed the cart against the wall. Then she walked out through the gate at the exact same pace she'd walked in with. And Mannheim, still convinced he understood exactly who mattered and who didn't, thought to himself, nobody. The cart is gone. The school building in Saarburg was damaged further during the fighting later that year and eventually demolished during post-war reconstruction. The 11 folders André carried out in his toolbox now sit permanently in the French National Archives. Hélène's full 68-page testimony sits in that same archive. And Captain Albright's 4-word note on page 61, "She was nobody, though," is still there in pencil, exactly where he wrote it the night before he drove to Saarbrücken to arrest the man who had said those words first, 2 years earlier, in a courtyard he thought he fully controlled. Somewhere in the space between what Mannheim said in that courtyard in 1945 and what Albright quietly wrote in that archive in 1947, the entire truth of this story lives. A man looked at a woman and saw nobody. She saw exactly what he saw. And then she used it. Hit like if you think she deserved to be remembered as anything but nobody.